The gavel of her palm hit the table before the first word left her mouth. I didn't flinch. 26 men had once tried to intimidate me out of a warehouse deal with worse than a slap on mahogany, and every one of them had left that room poorer than when they walked in. But this wasn't a stranger across a negotiating table. This was the woman who had slept under my roof for 18 years, calling me times dad times at every Thanksgiving, while she planned the exact morning she'd bury me alive. "He's not fit to run anything anymore," she said, loud enough for the 12 executives lining the walls to hear every syllable. "Grief has broken him. We're doing this for his own good." Grief. As if she knew the first thing about it. As if she'd spent one single night beside a hospital bed listening to the woman she loved take her last breath. I sat at the far end of the table, in the seat they'd left for me like a courtesy, the seat of a man they'd already decided didn't matter. My son sat 2 chairs down from her, staring at his own hands, unable to lift his eyes to mine. 45 years old, and still hiding behind his wife's skirt the way he had at 7. She slid a folder toward me. On top of it sat a gold pen, placed just so, like a loaded gun offered handle first. "Sign it," she said, "and we can all move on." I looked at that pen for a long moment, long enough for her smile to widen, certain she was watching a broken old man surrender everything he'd built with his own 2 hands. She had no idea what was sitting in a locked drawer 40 feet above her head. She had no idea that 3 days earlier, in a hospital corridor that still smelled of bleach and fear, I had done a piece of simple arithmetic that no doctor in that building dared say out loud, and that the answer to it was about to end her entire life as she knew it. I reached out. I picked up the pen. "And that is exactly where I need to take you back 3 days. To the morning I buried my wife, and the family I thought I still had walked into my kitchen wearing black and carrying a folder of their own. If a family member has ever smiled at you while planning to destroy you, tell me where you're watching from tonight in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and stay to the end, because the man holding that pen is about to teach every person in that boardroom exactly what sign it is going to cost them." The water had gone cold in my hands before I noticed it. I stood at the kitchen sink for I don't know how long, washing a single glass over and over, watching the suds swirl down the drain like something I could actually control. 3 days. Eleanor had been gone exactly 3 days, and the house still smelled like her, like the lilies from the funeral, wilting now in a crystal vase on the counter. And underneath that, faintly, the lavender soap she'd used every morning of our 46 years together. I kept expecting to hear her slippers on the hardwood. I kept forgetting, every few minutes, that I never would again. Grief does something strange to a man who built an empire with his bare hands. It doesn't make you weak. It hollows you out, and leaves the shape of yourself standing upright, going through the motions, while the actual man is somewhere else entirely, still holding his wife's hand in a hospice room that no longer exists. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on the towel she'd embroidered decades ago, back when Delacroix Development Group was 2 men in a pickup truck and a dream neither of us could quite afford. That towel had survived house fires, 2 recessions, and a hurricane. It had not survived her. That was when I heard the heels, sharp, deliberate, clicking against my hardwood floor with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted she belonged there. I didn't turn around right away. I'd learned, in 50 years of negotiating with dangerous people, that the ones who announce themselves loudest are rarely the ones you need to fear most. But Simone had always been the exception to every rule I'd ever trusted. She walked into my kitchen wearing a black dress that cost more than most men's monthly salary, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, not a single tear or a single hair out of place. She did not ask how I was holding up. She did not offer the small human decency of a hug. She set a thick folder down on my granite countertop, the same granite Eleanor had spent 3 weekends choosing, and the sound of it hitting the stone was loud enough to make me flinch. I looked down at it, then back up at her. "What is this, Simone?" She sighed, the exaggerated, theatrical sigh of a woman performing patience for an audience of one. "It's for your own good, Cormac. You're 72 years old. You just lost her. You are in absolutely no condition to run this company right now, and everyone who loves you can see it. I stared at the top page. Power of attorney and voting share transfer. Not a request. A document already drafted. Already notarized in a blank field waiting only for my signature. Already engineered by someone who understood exactly which levers to pull. They were not asking me to hand the company to my grandson, the way Simone had once threatened in an offhand comment I'd foolishly dismissed as grief talk of her own. This was smarter, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. This was a document that would let them claim, later, in any courtroom in this country, that I had been mentally unfit, a grieving old man too broken by sorrow to be trusted with his own signature. And once that claim existed on paper, notarized and dated the week I buried my wife, they could do anything they wanted with the company I had built from nothing. Sell it, gut it, hand it to whoever was paying the largest number under the table, and I would have no legal standing left to stop them, because I would have already signed the document that said I couldn't be trusted to think clearly. My son walked in behind her, and it was his cowardice, not hers, that told me everything I needed to know before either of them said another word. He stood in the doorway of my own kitchen like a guest waiting for permission to sit, 45 years old, wearing a suit I had paid for, refusing to meet my eyes. "Dad," he said finally, stepping forward and resting a hand on my shoulder with the practiced gentleness of a man who had rehearsed this gesture in a mirror. "Please, just listen to her. Your blood pressure's been through the roof since Mom got sick. We're terrified of losing you too. Just sign it. Let us handle the company for a while. You can finally rest." It sounded so reasonable. That was the horror of it. It sounded exactly like love. A son and daughter-in-law stepping in to shoulder an old man's burden. If I hadn't spent 5 decades in boardrooms watching men use kindness as a scalpel, I might have believed it myself. I looked down at the gold pen resting beside the folder, placed with obscene precision, and I thought about my hands. These same hands that had poured concrete in a Texas summer at 98 degrees. These same hands that had signed the deed to our very first property with Eleanor standing beside me, both of us too broke and too in love to know we were about to build something that would outlive us both. My hands had built Delacroix Development Group out of absolutely nothing but stubbornness and a woman who believed in me before I believed in myself. And now, my own son was standing in my kitchen, 3 days after we buried her, asking me to hand every ounce of that history over to people who had never once picked up a hammer in their lives. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, and I meant every syllable to sound exactly as broken as they wanted it to sound. "Let me read through it properly before I sign anything." Ellison's shoulders sagged with visible relief, the relief of a man who had expected outright refusal and gotten a stall instead, which in his narrow understanding was as good as a yes. "Of course, Dad, take all the time you need." A pause, and then, almost gently, the knife. "Just don't wait too long. The market's volatile right now. The company needs steady leadership." Steady leadership. From the boy who had never once balanced a checkbook without help. They left together a few minutes later, their footsteps retreating down the hallway I had walked 10,000 times, past photographs of a family I no longer entirely recognized. I stood alone in the kitchen, the folder heavy and cold under my palm, the faucet still dripping faintly behind me. And then I saw her reflection. The bay window at the end of the hallway had gone dark against the evening sky, turned into a perfect black mirror by the absence of daylight, and in it I watched Simone pause near the front door. She pulled out her phone. Her thumbs moved fast, urgent, practiced. She had absolutely no idea I could see her from 30 feet away. No idea that a lifetime of reading rooms full of liars had taught me to notice exactly this kind of careless, arrogant mistake. She hit send, and I watched her lips move as she muttered something under her breath, words I couldn't fully hear, but didn't need to. I knew triumph when I saw it on a woman's face, even from behind, even reflected in glass. They thought I was finished. A broken old widower, 3 days into a grief so total it had scooped out everything but the shell of the man who used to run this company like a general running a war. They thought the hardest part was already over, that all that remained was paperwork and patience. They had no idea that the wolf they'd cornered still had every single one of his teeth. And they had absolutely no idea what was about to happen the next morning. When I walked into my own headquarters at 6 a.m. and discovered that my master key card, the one that had never once, in 20 years, failed to open a single door in that building, had suddenly, conveniently, stopped working. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the bed Eleanor and I had shared for 30 years, staring at the ceiling, listening to a house that had never once in 4 decades sounded this empty. By 5:30, I gave up pretending sleep would come and pulled on a suit instead, not out of vanity, but because I needed to stand inside the walls of Delacroix Development Group and remember exactly who I was before I became the grieving old fool my son and his wife had decided to bury. The drive to headquarters felt different in the dark. The city hadn't woken up yet. The glass tower I'd fought 30 years to build against zoning boards, hostile bankers, and men who'd underestimated a contractor's son from a 2-bedroom rental house rose up in front of me exactly as it always had, except this time. Walking through the empty lobby, nodding to the night guard, I felt something close to dread. I bypassed my own office and walked straight to the executive records vault at the end of the top floor. If Simone and Ellison were preparing to alter the company's foundational trust documents, the paper trail would live there, behind a door only a handful of master credentials had ever opened. I swiped my card. The reader beeped once, flat and mechanical, and the small light above the handle blinked red. I stared at it for a moment, genuinely confused, before swiping again. Red. A third time. Red again, the sound sharper now, almost mocking. Having some trouble, Cormac? I turned. Damien Ashgate stood a few feet away near the executive break room, dressed far too crisply for 6 in the morning, his cologne rolling toward me in a wave thick enough to taste. 45 years old, always tailored, always smiling with his mouth and never his eyes. I had hired him 8 years ago because he was brilliant with numbers. I had never once, until this exact moment, wondered whether brilliant men could also be dangerous ones. My MasterCard's not reading, I said, keeping my voice level. It's rejecting me at the vault. Ah, right. He smiled wider, entirely unbothered. We're running a full security migration this weekend. Ellison authorized it personally. Said you'd be taking some time off to grieve, so it seemed like the right window to overhaul the access protocols. Nothing to worry about. Go home and rest, Cormac. We've got everything handled. Ellison authorized it. I let those 3 words settle in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. My son, who had never once in his life authorized so much as a printer order without asking permission, had suddenly found the initiative to lock his own father out of a vault, holding 30 years of financial history 4 days after his mother's funeral. I did not grab Damien by his silk tie the way the old version of me might have. I did not demand the security team override the lock in front of him. A man who shows his hand in a fight he hasn't finished planning is a man who loses the fight entirely. And I had not survived 5 decades of hostile negotiations by losing my temper at the exact moment my enemies were hoping I would. Tell Ellison I appreciate the sudden interest in data security, I said mildly, and turned toward my private office, feeling Damien's smug gaze on my back the whole way there. Behind my locked door, I opened the hidden compartment beneath my desk, the one only my thumbprint could access. Holding the encrypted backup drive I'd installed a decade ago during an ugly corporate espionage scare, nobody at this company remembered anymore except me. They thought controlling the servers meant controlling the truth. They had no idea I'd built a door of my own that predated all of theirs. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, seconds from breaking through whatever wall Damien had built, when my private cell phone screamed to life against the desk. Almost no one had that number. Certainly not at 6:30 in the morning. I looked at the screen. Memorial Hospital. Mr. Delacroix, a woman said, her voice carrying the practiced, terrible calm of someone trained to deliver emergencies without causing panic. This is the emergency department. We need you here immediately. Your grandson, Callum, has been in a serious motorcycle accident. I don't remember the drive. I remember running red lights I've never run in my life, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to honestly since the week Eleanor's diagnosis came back. Whatever Callum was to this family's tangled truths, he was still the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle. He was still, in every way that had mattered to me for 19 years, my grandson. I found Ellison and Simone in the trauma ward hallway. Simone paced with her phone in her hand, more inconvenienced than devastated. Ellison sat slumped in a plastic chair, his tailored suit crumpled, his face gray. He took a corner too fast, Ellison told me, his voice shaking. Hit a guardrail. He's stable, but he lost a lot of blood before the paramedics got there. Simone crossed her arms and let out a sharp, irritated breath. This is a disaster, Cormac. We were supposed to finalize the trust transfer this afternoon. I stared at her, stunned by the sheer callousness of a woman standing feet from her son's trauma bay, already calculating the inconvenience to her paperwork. Before I could say a word, the trauma doors swung open and an exhausted physician stepped out, scrubs stained dark at the cuffs. He's stable for now, the doctor said, but his hemoglobin is dropping fast. He needs a transfusion immediately, and we have a shortage. He's AB positive, a rare type in our current inventory. We need direct family donors, cross-matched right now. The world went very quiet around me. AB positive. I am O. Eleanor was O. Two O-type parents cannot, under any law of human biology, produce an AB positive child. I had learned that fact in a high school science classroom 60 years ago and never once had reason to question it until this second, standing in a fluorescent-lit hallway, doing the arithmetic my mind refused to stop doing even as every other part of me begged it to. Ellison was my biological son, which meant Ellison was O, or at worst A or B, never AB, not from two O parents. Simone, I recalled from an old conversation years back, was type A. An O father and an A mother could produce a child who was A or O, never AB. The dominant B trait had to come from somewhere else entirely, from a biological father who actually carried it. I turned my head slowly and looked at my son. I expected confusion. I expected him to ask the doctor, bewildered, whether there'd been some clerical error. Instead, Ellison was staring at the floor, gripping the handrail with white knuckles, sweat beading on a forehead that had gone the color of old paper. He was not confused. He was terrified. And when his eyes finally lifted and met mine across that sterile hallway, I understood, in one single devastating heartbeat, that my son had known this truth for a very long time and had chosen, every single day since, to let me love a boy who did not carry a single drop of my blood, rather than risk losing a company he had never once earned the right to inherit. Simone did not wait for anyone's permission. She pulled out a platinum card and shoved it toward the doctor, demanding he charter a private helicopter transfer from a hospital across the state that carried surplus AB-positive units, her voice sharp with the entitled fury of a woman who had never once in her life been told no. The doctor, visibly unimpressed but out of options, agreed to make the calls. Within the hour, the transfusion was arranged, and Callum was wheeled back toward surgery, stable enough to survive the wait. I did not confront Ellison in that hallway. A cornered animal lashes out in public where witnesses can later testify to his innocence. I had learned that lesson decades ago in boardrooms far less forgiving than a hospital corridor. Instead, I suggested we get coffee while we waited, and he followed me down to the bleak, fluorescent-lit cafeteria in the basement without a single word of protest. We sat across from each other at a sticky plastic table, 2 cups of bitter coffee going cold between us. I kept my voice level, almost gentle. The doctor said AB positive, I said. Your mother and I were both O. Your O, Simone's an A. Explain the math to me, Ellison. Because I've spent 60 years trusting that biology doesn't lie, and right now I need you to tell me it does. He didn't answer with confusion. He answered with rage, sudden, explosive, entirely disproportionate to an innocent man's reaction. He slammed his cup down hard enough to slosh coffee across the table and snapped that I was grieving, confused, imagining conspiracies where a lab tech had simply made a typo on a chart. He accused me of using his son's hospital bed to stage some paranoid interrogation. I sat perfectly still and let him finish. I had negotiated with hundreds of desperate men across hundreds of tables, and I knew exactly what genuine confusion sounded like. This was not that. This was the sound of a man protecting a lie he had lived inside for years, using my grief as a shield the way a coward reaches for anything within arm's length when he's finally cornered. I told him I was probably right. It was probably just a clerical error. I watched him nod too quickly, too grateful for the reprieve, and I understood then that whatever truth was buried beneath this family, my own son had chosen it over me a long time ago. That evening, I drove to their house carrying 2 containers of soup transferred into glass dishes to look homemade, a grieving father's gesture, harmless and expected. Beneath my coat, folded into my pocket, were latex gloves and sterile evidence bags I'd purchased on the way, the kind sold openly in any pharmacy to anyone with cash and a reason. Ellison let me in, exhausted and hollow, still wearing the wrinkled suit from the hospital. I told them both I couldn't sleep and wanted to bring dinner. Simone barely looked up from a stack of insurance paperwork at the Marble Island, more concerned with the cost of the helicopter transfer than her son's survival. While Ellison heated the soup, I excused myself to wash up and check on Callum, asleep upstairs with his leg elevated on a stack of pillows. In his bathroom, gloved, I opened the medicine cabinet and lifted his electric toothbrush from its holder, still faintly damp, and sealed it into the first bag without letting my bare skin touch the bristles. On my way back down, I detoured through the mudroom where Ellison, a creature of rigid habit, always dumped his gym clothes into a wicker hamper rather than carry them the extra 10 feet to the washing machine. His gray athletic jacket sat on top, exactly where laziness had left it. Woven into the collar lining were 2 dark hairs, roots still intact. I lifted them free with a pair of tweezers I'd brought for exactly this purpose and sealed them into the second bag. I stayed another 10 minutes, playing the role of the tired, grateful grandfather, and left before either of them could question why I'd needed so long upstairs. I did not drive home. I drove 2 towns over to a private genetics laboratory I'd called ahead of time, paid $5,000 in cash for an expedited 72-hour analysis, and walked out into the cold morning air feeling, for the first time in 3 days, that I had finally taken back a piece of control. That was when my phone lit up with an automated security alert, the kind generated only by the invisible backdoor I had coded directly into Delacroix Development Group's servers a decade ago, during a corporate espionage scare that had frightened me badly enough to build a failsafe no one else on Earth knew existed. Not the board, not Eleanor, not a single soul but me. Someone was attempting to authorize a wire transfer of $4.5 million, using a spoofed version of my own digital signature. I drove straight home instead of to the office. Confronting whoever sat at that terminal would only give them time to scrub the servers clean before I could see the whole picture. I locked myself in my study, closed the blinds, and typed the sequence of commands I hadn't used in 10 years. The screen flooded with cascading green code, and I slipped invisibly into the exact terminal that had triggered the alert, the executive financial suite. Damien Ashgate, already awake, already working, already trying to force a transfer through using credentials built to mimic mine. His architecture was clever on the surface and hollow underneath. He had never imagined anyone could swim beneath the foundation he'd built to keep the rest of the staff blind. With a handful of keystrokes, I froze his transfer in a quarantine of my own design, trapping $4.5 million in a place he could neither complete nor cancel. Then I traced its intended destination and found a labyrinth. 4 shell companies, freshly registered in Delaware under meaningless corporate names, each one issuing fabricated invoices for consulting services and software upgrades that had never existed. Each payment calibrated with surgical precision to slide just beneath the threshold that would trigger an automatic board review. I cross-referenced the dates against the company's master ledger, and the nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of my desk. The money wasn't coming from operating revenue. It was coming from the employee pension fund, the retirement savings of every foreman, site manager, and laborer who had built this company alongside me, brick by brick, for 30 years. The first withdrawal was dated 8 months ago, the exact week Eleanor received her diagnosis. While I sat in oncology waiting rooms holding my wife's hand as she died by inches, my daughter-in-law and my chief financial officer had been quietly bleeding my company dry. Using my own grief as cover for a robbery they had clearly been planning for far longer than 8 months. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor, the only light in the room, and understood at last what the succession folder on my kitchen counter had truly been for. It was never about handing Ellison the company. It was a legal shield, an indemnification clause, and an audit authorization, both requiring my signature, both designed to make me the legally responsible party. The moment federal auditors discovered the hole in the pension fund 3 weeks from now, they didn't just want to steal my company. They wanted my signature to bury the theft under my name. The call came on the morning of the 3rd day. A flat, professional voice on a burner line telling me the results were sealed and ready for pickup. I didn't ask for the numbers over the phone. Some truths deserve to be held in your own 2 hands before they're allowed to break you. The drive to the clinic felt longer than it had 3 nights earlier, though the distance hadn't changed, only I had. I collected the tamper-proof envelope from a receptionist too young and too cheerful for a building that specialized in delivering the worst news a family could receive, and I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time before I finally tore it open. Probability of paternity, 0%. There it was, printed in cold, clinical language beneath charts and genetic markers I didn't need to understand to grasp the verdict. Callum Delacroix did not share a single drop of blood with my son. 19 years of birthdays, graduations, and quiet pride I'd poured into a boy I believed carried my name forward. All of it built on a lie so complete it had fooled a father who had never once, in 50 years of business, been fooled by anyone. For 1 full minute, grief swallowed me whole. I mourned the grandson I never actually had. I thanked whatever mercy existed in the universe that Eleanor had died before learning her family's bloodline had been quietly erased and replaced without her knowledge. Then the grief burned away, and what replaced it was colder and infinitely more useful. If Ellison wasn't the father, the question answered itself the moment I let myself ask it honestly. Simone was too calculating a woman to risk her comfortable, subsidized life on a meaningless stranger. Whoever fathered that boy had to be someone useful, someone with deep, unsupervised access to the exact financial architecture currently bleeding my pension fund dry. I drove straight to Percival Crow's office, a private investigator who'd spent 2 decades hunting white-collar criminals for the federal government before deciding the private sector paid better for the same skill set. I handed him a blank check and one instruction: start with Damien Ashgate. 3 days later, we sat across from each other in a diner far from anywhere either of us was known, and Percival slid a thick folder across the table with the quiet satisfaction of a man who enjoyed being right. The photographs came first: Damien and Simone at a secluded restaurant, his hand resting over hers, the kind of intimacy no business relationship could explain away. Then the records. They hadn't met 5 years ago during a corporate restructuring, as they'd always claimed. They'd met 20 years earlier, at an out-of-state business college, lived together for 2 years, and made a calculated decision when neither of them had the family wealth to fund the lives they wanted. 19 years of a relationship that had never once stopped, running quietly underneath my son's entire marriage. I pulled a discrete sample from Damien yesterday, Percival said. Ran it against your grandson's profile. He's the biological father, Cormac. Simone was already pregnant with his child before she ever married your son. The final piece of the folder was worse than anything I'd braced for. A printed email, 10 years old, sent from Ellison's private account to Simone's. My son, describing test results from a specialist confirming a childhood infection, had left him permanently sterile, begging her to help him hide it, because if I ever learned he couldn't provide a biological heir, the bloodline clause in Eleanor's trust would cut him out entirely and send our fortune to charity. Callum is the only thing keeping my inheritance secure. My father must never know. Ellison had known for 10 years. He hadn't simply been deceived by his wife, he had been a willing architect of the fraud, raising another man's child, deceiving his own dying mother, all to protect a paycheck he'd never once earned honestly. I sat in that vinyl booth until the letters blurred together, and something in my chest went permanently, mercifully cold. I thanked Percival for his work, told him this was exactly what I needed, and drove home with the dossier resting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. That night, I staged my study the way a man stages a trap. Dim lighting. Eleanor's photograph placed prominently on the desk, her smile the first thing anyone would see walking in. I unbuttoned my collar, ruffled my hair, let my shoulders sag with the specific, theatrical exhaustion of a man who had finally surrendered. When Ellison and Simone arrived that evening, I let one genuine tear slip down my cheek, grief for Eleanor, real and unrehearsed, and told them, in a voice I let crack on cue, that they were right. I couldn't do this anymore. I would sign the transfer. I wanted it finalized quickly. At Friday's board meeting, in front of everyone, Simone's eyes lit with naked, unguarded greed. Ellison patted my trembling hand and told me this was the right decision, that he'd make me proud. I did not correct him. They left believing they'd finally broken me, and within 48 hours their arrogance metastasized into something almost gleeful. By Wednesday afternoon, Damien had walked into the office of Thomas Weller, my loyal vice president of 2 decades, and handed him a severance package under the banner of restructuring. By Thursday, my director of human resources and my logistics coordinator had followed him out the door, replaced by sycophants Damien had handpicked to look the other way while the theft continued. I walked the halls Thursday morning like a ghost, shoulders slumped, playing the departing founder paying his last respects to a life's work. I passed my own corner office and found Simone standing inside it with 2 interior designers, pointing at the mahogany paneling and demanding it be stripped white, already measuring for imported furniture that would replace the desk, where Eleanor and I had once toasted our very first $1 million contract with champagne in paper cups. She told me not to worry, they'd box up my personal items for me later. I thanked her for her consideration and walked away, feeling nothing but the cold, patient anticipation of a man who had already set every trap in motion and was simply waiting, now, for Friday morning to arrive. Friday morning arrived cold and clean, the kind of light that makes a city look freshly rinsed of everything ugly that happened in it the night before. I stood in my closet and bypassed the somber, defeated suits I'd worn all week, choosing instead a charcoal bespoke piece with sharp lapels, the armor I reserved for the days I intended to end someone's career. I dressed slowly, deliberately, buttoning each cuff the way Eleanor used to watch me do before the biggest deals of my life, and when I looked in the mirror, the broken widower of the past week was gone entirely. Staring back at me was the man who had built Delacroix Development Group out of nothing but stubbornness and a woman who believed in him before anyone else did. I picked up her pearl necklace from the nightstand and held it for a moment, drawing whatever strength a dead woman's jewelry could still offer a living man, then walked downstairs and out to my truck. The boardroom was already full when I arrived. Simone had made certain of that, orchestrating an audience for her moment of triumph the way a woman plans a wedding rather than a hostile takeover. She sat at the head of the table, in the chair that had been mine for 30 years. Ellison sat pale and sweating beside her. Damien occupied the seat on her other side, wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin that made my stomach turn. Callum sat further down, scrolling his phone, oblivious to the war being fought over his own biology. The rest of the table held Damien's newly hired sycophants, watching me shuffle toward the only remaining chair with the specific pity people reserve for a man they believe is already finished. I sat. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch until even the antique clock in the corner sounded loud. Simone leaned forward, resting her manicured hands flat on the mahogany. A thick folder slid down the table toward me, a gold pen balanced neatly on top like an offering. "This is the final agreement," she said, her voice sharp now, stripped of the sugary sympathy she'd worn in my kitchen 5 nights earlier. "All that's needed is your signature." I looked down at the papers. Somewhere buried in that language was the indemnification clause that would legally chain a $4.5 million theft to my own name the moment federal auditors came looking. I looked back up at her, and whatever mask she'd been wearing for 18 years finally, fully slipped. "Now that the old woman is gone," she said, her voice dripping with a venom she no longer bothered to hide, "you will put this company in my son's name and fend for yourself. You're done here, Cormac. It's our turn now." The words hung in the recycled air of that room, and I understood I was finally looking at the real woman who had lived under my roof for nearly 2 decades, pretending to grieve a mother-in-law she'd never once respected. I picked up the gold pen. I turned it slowly in my fingers, and I looked, one last time, at my son. I gave him a single, final chance, a silent question only he could answer, to stand up, to admit what he'd done, to be a man before the floor opened beneath him. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, some last flinch of conscience. Then he looked away, down at his shoes, exactly as he had in my kitchen 5 days earlier. I set the pen down. It made a small, quiet sound against the wood. "No," I said. Before Simone could process the word, the double doors of the boardroom swung open, and Percival Crowe walked in, flanked by nothing but his own reputation and a black leather briefcase. He did not introduce himself to the room. He walked straight to the head of the table, stopped a few feet from Simone's chair, and unclasped his briefcase with a sharp metallic snap that cut through the silence like a gunshot. He pulled out the sealed genetic report and let it fall onto the exact center of the table, sliding to a stop between Simone and Ellison. "I represent Cormac Delacroix in all matters concerning the succession of Delacroix Development Group," he announced, his voice a resonant baritone that filled every corner of the room. "The document in front of you is a certified, independently verified genetic analysis, completed within the last 72 hours. He didn't wait for trembling hands to open it. He recited the verdict from memory, each word landing like a blow. "The probability of paternity is 0%. Callum is definitively excluded as the biological offspring of Ellison Delacroix." The gasp that tore through the room came from Callum himself. He dropped his phone onto the table, his young face draining of color, turning to his mother with wide, betrayed eyes, silently begging her to deny it. Simone did not look at her son. Her composure shattered in real time, the confident predator replaced by something cornered and desperate, her mouth opening and closing with no words coming out. Beside her, Damien's smug grin collapsed entirely. He understood exactly what this meant before anyone had to explain it to him, and he shoved his chair back, half rising, some animal instinct telling him to run toward his office and start deleting whatever he could. Ellison exploded upward instead, pointing a shaking finger at his wife, his voice cracking into a pitch I'd never heard from him. "How could you do this to me? You made me raise another man's son. You used me to rob my own family." He turned toward me next, hands raised in a pathetic performance of victimhood, fake tears already welling. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the single sheet Percival had handed me in that diner, the 10-year-old email, printed and highlighted, and threw it across the table instead of handing it to him. It struck his chest and fluttered down beside the genetic report. "Don't you dare play the victim with me," I said, my voice dropping into something colder than I'd ever used with him before. "You've known for 10 years. You knew you were sterile, and you sold your own mother's honor for a paycheck. He looked down at his own handwriting, his own confession, and the fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by the ashen silence of a man watching his last lie collapse in front of a room full of witnesses. Simone rounded on Damien instead, her voice climbing into a shriek. This was supposed to be flawless. You told me the tracks were covered. Don't put this all on me, he snapped back, all pretense of composure gone. You were the one who wanted to accelerate the timeline while his wife was dying in hospice. The alliance they'd built over 19 years of careful, patient deception cracked apart right there at my table, each of them screaming pieces of the truth at the other in a desperate scramble to survive what was coming. Ellison sobbed openly into his hands. Callum sat frozen, watching his entire identity dissolve in real time. The new executives Damien had hired sat in stunned silence, watching their brief, lucrative careers evaporate before their first paycheck. I did not feel a single ounce of pity watching it happen. I had spent 5 decades building something with my bare hands, while these people spent 19 years learning how to steal it without lifting one. Let them tear each other apart. It was, in its own way, the only honest thing any of them had done in this room in years. I looked toward Percival Crowe and gave him a single nod. He reached into his briefcase one more time, and this time, what he pulled out wasn't paper. What Percival Crowe pulled from his briefcase wasn't a pair of handcuffs. There would be no dramatic perp walk out of my own boardroom, no flashing lights outside the glass tower I had spent 30 years building with my own 2 hands. Real justice. I had learned long before that morning, in far too many courtrooms and far too many negotiating tables to count, rarely moves with the theatrical speed people expect from movies. It moves slowly, patiently, through paper, and paper had always been my native language, long before it became theirs. He laid 2 documents on the table, side by side, directly in front of Simone and Damien, and let the silence do half his work for him. A federal asset freeze order, Percival said, his voice steady and unhurried, issued this morning by the United States District Court, covering every account traced to the 4 shell entities registered in Delaware. And a formal subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission, compelling both of you to appear and account for 8 months of fraudulent wire activity connected directly to the Delacroix Development Group Employee Pension Fund. Simone stared down at the papers as though sheer force of will might rearrange the words into something less final. Damien said nothing at all. 20 years of confidence built on spreadsheets and stolen decimal points had finally run headfirst into a wall no amount of charm could rout around. You'll notice, Percival continued, almost gently, almost kind, in the specific way a surgeon is kind right before the incision, that both your passports were flagged as of 6 o'clock this morning. Neither of you is leaving this country. The federal investigators handling this file have been working directly from documentation my client provided 3 days ago. There is nowhere left to move this money, and nowhere left for either of you to move yourselves. I watched something in Simone finally break not the performance of breaking she'd offered in my kitchen 5 nights earlier, but something real, something that looked, for the first time in 18 years, entirely and helplessly human. She sat in the chair that had belonged to me for 30 years, surrounded by the wreckage of a scheme 19 years in the making, and for the first time since I'd known her, she had absolutely nothing to say. I stood up slowly. My knees ached the particular way. A 72-year-old man's knees ache after standing too long inside his own rage. But I did not let it show on my face. I had spent 5 decades learning never to let the room see what standing still actually cost me. I walked the length of that long table, past the new executives frozen in their borrowed chairs, past Callum staring blankly at a future he no longer recognized, until I stood directly beside my son. Ellison looked up at me, his face wrecked, his tie hanging loose. 10 years of a carefully guarded secret finally lying exposed on the table in front of every person who had ever mattered to his career. "Dad," he whispered, "please." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a single folded document, not thrown this time the way I'd thrown the email earlier, but placed gently, almost mercifully, into his lap. He looked down at it through tears and read the header. An eviction notice for the house I had purchased for his family 3 years earlier, paired with formal termination of his employment, effective immediately, and a legal amendment permanently striking him from Eleanor's trust. "You have 24 hours to remove your belongings," I told him. "You'll leave the keys on the counter. You will never set foot on that property again. You are terminated from this company, as of this moment, and you will not receive one single dollar of this family's estate, now or after I'm gone." "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked. And for one brief, unguarded second, I saw underneath 45 years of cowardice the small boy I used to carry on my shoulders through job sites on Saturday mornings, back before either of us understood what money could eventually do to a man's spine. "You made this choice 10 years ago," I said, my voice as flat and unforgiving as poured concrete left to cure. "You chose a paycheck over your mother's honor. You let me spend 19 years loving a boy who wasn't mine rather than risk losing a company you never once earned with your own hands. You do not get my forgiveness simply because the consequences finally caught up to you." I turned to Callum last, 19 years old, frozen in his chair, watching the only family he had ever known come apart in real time around him. He was guilty of nothing. He had been born into a lie he never asked for and never chose, and I would not make him carry the full weight of sins that belonged entirely to the adults who had used his own existence as a shield against consequence. "You're not responsible for what your mother and father did," I told him, keeping my voice deliberately softer than the one I'd used with Ellison. "But you're no longer part of this family, and you're no longer entitled to anything that name provides. I'll cover 1 year of tuition and basic living expenses. That's 12 months to find a job, secure student loans, and build a plan of your own. After that, you're entirely on your own." He nodded, a single tear sliding down his face, and whispered a thank you that sounded like the first honest sentence anyone had spoken in that room all morning. He gathered his backpack and walked out of a boardroom that had never truly belonged to him, into a world that owed him nothing, and would teach him that lesson far faster and far more thoroughly than I ever could. Federal agents took Simone and Damien into custody outside the building less than an hour later, quietly, without cameras, without the theater. Either of them had clearly spent years assuming their downfall would include if it ever came. There was no dramatic headline that afternoon, no perp walk for the evening news, just 2 sealed indictments, and a long, unglamorous road through the federal court system that would end exactly 6 months later, precisely where it needed to. 6 months is a long time when you're rebuilding an empire alone. It is an even longer time when you're a 72-year-old man learning how to live inside a house that no longer holds the woman who made it a home. I filled those months the only way I had ever known how to fill hard months, with work, with the slow, deliberate business of pulling my company back from the wreckage 2 predators had left behind while wearing my family's name. I called Thomas Weller and every other loyal executive Damien had fired in that brief, arrogant window of stolen power, offered each of them their old positions back along with bonuses and apologies I meant with my whole chest, and every single one of them returned without hesitation. Together, working alongside federal investigators for weeks that felt like years, we traced the stolen pension funds through offshore accounts in Delaware shell corporations until every last dollar of that $4.5 million theft was recovered and restored, dollar for dollar, into the retirement accounts of the men and women who had actually built this company beside me with their own 2 hands. I stood in front of the entire staff the morning those funds were fully repaid, and I watched relief move through that room like weather, something physical, something you could feel settle over 400 exhausted shoulders at once. The federal trial concluded exactly 6 months after that boardroom morning, in a courthouse 2 hours from the office where it had all begun. Simone and Damien were each sentenced to 15 years for wire fraud and pension embezzlement, a number the judge read aloud without a hint of sympathy in his voice. I sat in the gallery and watched Simone stand in a state-issued uniform, stripped of every designer label and every ounce of the performance she had spent 19 patient years perfecting, and I felt nothing resembling the satisfaction I had once imagined I would feel. Only a tired, bone-deep relief that the cancer, as Percival had once called it in a diner 2 towns over, was finally, permanently, cut out of my company for good. Ellison's punishment came without a judge or a jury or a sentence read aloud in a marble courtroom. Cut off entirely from the wealth he had spent his whole life quietly assuming was simply his birthright, he was forced, for the first time in 45 years, into the kind of reckoning that money had always let him avoid. I heard through the investigator I'd hired to confirm the eviction had gone through cleanly that he was working a minimum wage job at a home improvement store 2 towns from the mansion he used to live in, stocking shelves in a cheap polyester vest for a manager half his age. I felt no pity when I heard it. He was simply harvesting, at last, exactly what he had spent 10 quiet years of silence planting. On a clear Tuesday morning, almost exactly 6 months to the day after that boardroom, I rode the private elevator to the roof of Delacroix Development Group with Percival Crowe beside me, holding a leather portfolio containing the final documents that would permanently reshape everything I had left in this world. The wind-up there was sharp and clean, and the city stretched out below us the same way it had stretched out below me every single morning for 30 years. Entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside that glass tower. I signed my name across the final pages without a single moment of hesitation. 50% of everything I owned was placed into a new philanthropic trust bearing Eleanor's name, funding full, unrestricted scholarships for underprivileged young people who carried the ambition to build something real but never once had the resources to try the exact gift neither of us had ever been handed, and the exact gift she had always believed mattered infinitely more than any inheritance ever could. The remaining 50% went directly into an employee ownership program, distributed among the foremen, the site managers, and the laborers who had actually bled alongside me to build this company, rather than handed down to family members who had only ever bled it dry from the inside. I stood at the edge of that rooftop for a long time afterward, looking out over a city my own 2 hands had helped shape. One contract, one impossible early morning, one act of stubborn refusal to quit at a time. Family, I have come to understand at 72 years old, standing alone on a rooftop with absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone, was never a matter of blood, and it was certainly never a matter of a signature on a marriage certificate. It is a matter of loyalty, earned and re-earned every single day by people willing to actually show up when it costs them something. A wolf can lose his mate. He never loses his teeth. And on that rooftop, 6 months after burying my wife and cutting the rot out of everything we'd built together, I had just proven it, one final time, to everyone who had ever doubted it.